Have you ever held someone's life in your hands and had to choose between staying silent or destroying everything you know? Well, let me tell you about the day I stopped a CEO's funeral to save his life and how that single moment of courage changed absolutely everything I thought I knew about loyalty, truth, and the thin line between life and death. My name doesn't matter, but what I did that cold September morning will haunt me forever in the most beautiful and terrifying way possible. I was just a maid, someone invisible in the grand mansion of one of the most powerful men in the city. But sometimes the people no one sees are the ones who see everything. This is my story, raw and unfiltered, about the day I looked into a coffin and whispered 3 words that would shatter a family, expose dark secrets, and ultimately save a man who everyone believed was already gone. "He's still breathing," I said, and the entire world stopped. But before I tell you about that moment, about the gasps and the chaos and the accusations that followed, I need to take you back to where it all began, to the quiet moments before the storm when I was still just another face in the background, cleaning floors and arranging flowers, completely unaware that my life was about to become a thriller I never asked to star in. The mansion where I worked wasn't just a house. It was a monument to success, a sprawling estate with marble floors that echoed your footsteps, crystal chandeliers that caught the light like frozen waterfalls, and rooms so vast you could lose yourself in them for hours. Mr. Harrison, the CEO, was a man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room, not because he was loud or boastful, but because he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from building empires from nothing. I'd been working there for 3 years, and in all that time, I'd learned to read the house like a book, to understand its rhythms and secrets, to know when something was off just by the way the air felt. I wasn't supposed to notice things. I was supposed to clean and stay invisible. But invisibility has its advantages because people say and do things around you they'd never do if they remembered you were there. I saw the tension in the family dinners, heard the arguments behind closed doors, noticed the way Mrs. Harrison's smile never quite reached her eyes, observed how the son, Marcus, looked at his father with something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite love. I saw prescription bottles appearing in Mr. Harrison's bathroom, watched him growing thinner, noticed the way he'd sometimes grip the edge of his desk as if the room was spinning. But I never said anything because that wasn't my place, and who would listen to a maid anyway? I was there to work, to earn my paycheck, to support my own family back home who depended on every dollar I sent them. Yet despite my determination to remain invisible, I couldn't help but feel a connection to Mr. Harrison, something I can't quite explain even now. He was one of the few people in that house who actually saw me, who would say good morning and mean it, who once asked about my daughter's surgery and actually remembered to follow up weeks later. He treated me like a human being, not just a function, and that small kindness planted something in my heart that would later grow into the courage I desperately needed. In those final weeks before everything fell apart, I started noticing things that made my skin crawl, details so subtle that I questioned my own sanity for even considering them suspicious. The way certain family members whispered in corners and fell silent when others approached, how medications seemed to multiply in Mr. Harrison's routine, the strange visits from a doctor I'd never seen before, who never seemed to actually examine the patient. I remember standing in the hallway one evening, polishing a mirror, when I overheard Mrs. Harrison on the phone saying something that made my blood run cold. "It won't be much longer now. Just be patient." The words themselves were innocent enough, could have been about anything. But the tone, the cold calculation in her voice sent shivers down my spine. I told myself I was being paranoid, that grief and stress were making me imagine conspiracies where none existed, but deep down, something primal was screaming that danger was circling this house like a vulture waiting for death. I wanted to say something, to warn someone, but what could I possibly say? That I had a feeling? That intuition was telling me something was wrong? I had no proof, no evidence, nothing but a gnawing sense of dread that followed me through every room I cleaned, every bed I made, every meal I served. The tension built day by day, like a storm gathering on the horizon, and I could feel it in every interaction, every glance, every carefully controlled conversation. Mr. Harrison himself seemed to sense something too. I caught him looking at his family with questions in his eyes, with a wariness that hadn't been there before, as if he was seeing them clearly for the first time, and not entirely liking what he saw. He started locking his office door, something he'd never done before, and I noticed him making phone calls late at night, his voice hushed and urgent. One morning, I found him in the library, staring at family photos with an expression of such profound sadness that I almost asked if he was okay, almost broke my own rule about staying invisible, But the words died in my throat, because what right did I have to intrude on his private moments? So I cleaned around him in silence, and he never acknowledged my presence, lost in whatever dark thoughts were consuming him. The morning it happened started like any other, with the pale light of dawn filtering through the mansion's enormous windows, casting long shadows across the floors I'd just finished cleaning. I arrived at 6 as always, let myself in through the service entrance, and began my routine. The house was eerily quiet, quieter than usual, with that heavy silence that feels almost physical, like the air itself is holding its breath. I remember feeling uneasy as I moved through the rooms, an inexplicable anxiety tightening in my chest, making it hard to breathe. When I reached the hallway outside Mr. Harrison's office, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, which was unusual because he always kept it locked when he wasn't inside. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle, every instinct telling me to turn around and walk away, to not get involved, to stay in my lane. But something stronger than fear pulled me forward, some desperate need to know, to confirm that everything was okay. I pushed the door open slowly, calling out his name softly, and the sight that greeted me will be burned into my memory until the day I die. Mr. Harrison was slumped over his desk, his face pale as death, his body completely still, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, I was convinced I was looking at a corpse. My first instinct was to scream, to run, to get help, but instead I found myself moving toward him on trembling legs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I reached out with a shaking hand and touched his shoulder, and his skin was cool but not cold, and that tiny detail would later become the thread I couldn't let go of. When I checked for a pulse, my untrained fingers found nothing, and panic absolutely consumed me as I stumbled backward, my mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. I should call an ambulance. I should alert the family. I should do something. Anything. But I stood there frozen, staring at this man who had shown me kindness, trying to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my brain kept screaming that he was dead, that there was nothing to be done, but some deeper instinct, some whisper from a place beyond logic, kept insisting that something was wrong with this picture, that death shouldn't look quite like this. His color was too good for someone who'd been dead for hours. There was no rigor mortis setting in, no obvious signs of the decay that begins almost immediately after death, and his lips had just the faintest hint of blue, like someone who wasn't getting enough oxygen rather than someone whose heart had stopped entirely. I don't know how long I stood there, seconds or minutes. Time had lost all meaning, but eventually the survival part of my brain kicked in, and I ran from the room, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways as I searched desperately for someone, anyone, to help me make sense of what I'd found. Mrs. Harrison was the first person I encountered, and when I told her, gasping and crying, that her husband was dead in his office, her reaction was not what I expected. She didn't scream or cry or rush to his side. Instead, she went very still, her face becoming a carefully composed mask, and she said in a voice that was almost too calm, "Are you certain?" The question struck me as odd even in my panicked state, because how could anyone not be certain about death? But I nodded frantically, and she simply said, "I see. Don't touch anything. I'll handle this." Her composure was unnatural, inhuman almost, and it added another layer of wrongness to an already impossible situation. Within hours, the mansion transformed into a hub of controlled chaos, with family members arriving, doctors being called, and funeral arrangements being made with a speed that seemed almost indecent. A private doctor arrived, examined the body briefly, and pronounced Mr. Harrison dead of apparent heart failure, a conclusion that everyone seemed to accept without question. No autopsy was ordered, no investigation launched. Everything moved forward with a momentum that felt orchestrated, rehearsed even. I watched it all from the margins, continuing my duties because I didn't know what else to do, and the whole time, that nagging feeling in my gut grew stronger and stronger, screaming that something was terribly, horribly wrong. I kept thinking about his skin, still warm, about the absence of rigor mortis, about the faint coloring that didn't match true death. Have you ever known something deep in your bones but had absolutely no way to prove it? No evidence to support what your intuition is screaming? That was me for those 3 days between his death and the funeral, torn between my instinct and the apparent reality everyone else accepted without question. The days leading up to the funeral were surreal, like living in a dream where nothing quite makes sense but you can't wake up. I moved through the mansion like a ghost, cleaning rooms that would soon be filled with mourners. Arranging flowers for a man I couldn't accept was truly gone. listening to family members discuss inheritance and business transitions with barely concealed eagerness. The whole atmosphere felt wrong, poisoned somehow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except me. Mrs. Harrison transformed before my eyes, shedding her usual cold composure for a performance of grief that would have been convincing if I hadn't spent 3 years watching her genuine emotions, or lack thereof. She wore black, spoke in hushed tones, dabbed at dry eyes with expensive handkerchiefs, and accepted condolences with practiced grace, but I never once saw real tears, never witnessed authentic sorrow. Her son Marcus was even worse, barely bothering to hide his satisfaction at his father's death, already making calls about taking over the company, discussing restructuring plans as if his father had been gone for months instead of days. The daughter, Sarah, seemed genuinely upset, but her grief felt more like relief than sadness, as if a burden had been lifted rather than a loved one lost. I wanted to scream at all of them, to shake them and demand to know why no one else saw what I saw, why no one questioned the convenient timing, the rapid pronouncement of death, the unseemly haste to bury him. But I was just the maid, invisible and voiceless, my observations worth nothing against the collective agreement of a powerful family. I kept returning to the office where I'd found him, drawn by something I couldn't name, and each time I'd stand in the doorway and replay that morning in my mind, searching for details I might have missed. The room had been cleaned and organized, all traces of that horrible discovery erased, but I could still see him slumped over the desk, could still feel the coolness of his skin under my trembling fingers, could still remember that crucial detail that everyone else seemed to have overlooked or dismissed. That night I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in my small room at the back of the estate, my mind racing through possibilities and scenarios. What if he wasn't dead when I found him? What if he was in some kind of coma or state that mimicked death? What if the doctor who pronounced him dead was in on whatever was happening? The thoughts seemed crazy even to me, like conspiracy theories spun from paranoia and grief, but I couldn't let them go. I got up and did something I'd never done before. I went online and started researching conditions that could mimic death, and what I found terrified and galvanized me in equal measure. There were documented cases of catalepsy, of locked-in syndrome, of drug-induced states that slowed the body's functions to nearly undetectable levels, of people being pronounced dead only to wake up in morgues or, horrifyingly, coffins. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I wasn't crazy, that my instincts were trying to tell me something everyone else was missing or deliberately ignoring. I printed articles, took notes, built a case in my mind for why we needed to do more tests, get a second opinion, delay the burial. But who would listen to me? I was nobody, a domestic worker with no medical training, no authority, no voice that mattered in the world these people inhabited. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday, a private ceremony at the family's mausoleum, and as the day approached, my anxiety reached unbearable levels. I barely ate, couldn't focus on my work, jumped at every sound, and spent every free moment obsessing over what I should do. Part of me screamed to stay quiet, to not risk my job and livelihood on what might be nothing more than wishful thinking and paranoid delusions, but a louder part, the part that remembered Mr. Harrison's kindness and humanity, refused to let him be buried without at least trying to voice my concerns. I decided I would speak to Mrs. Harrison privately, present my research, beg her to consider the possibility that her husband might not be dead. But every time I tried to approach her, I lost my nerve or was interrupted. The house was constantly full of visitors, business associates, distant relatives, all come to pay their respects and, I suspected, position themselves for whatever opportunities might arise from his death. I overheard conversations about stock options and board positions, about restructuring and new directions, and it made me sick to realize that to most of these people, Mr. Harrison was already nothing more than a memory to be leveraged for gain. Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the funeral, I finally cornered Mrs. Harrison in the library and forced myself to speak before I could chicken out. My voice shook as I told her about my concerns, about the research I'd done, about the possibility that her husband might be in a coma or some kind of suspended state rather than truly dead. She listened with an expression I couldn't read, and when I finished, there was a long, terrible silence before she spoke. Her voice was ice cold as she said, "Miss Rodriguez, I appreciate your concern, but you are not a doctor. My husband has been examined by a qualified physician and pronounced dead. What you're suggesting is not only medically impossible, but deeply offensive to me and my family. I expect you to drop this matter immediately and not spread these ridiculous theories to anyone else. Do you understand?" Her words felt like a slap, and I nodded mutely, backing out of the room with tears burning my eyes, humiliated and defeated. That night, I seriously considered quitting, packing my bags and leaving this cursed place behind, letting whatever was happening happen without me. But when I thought about Mr. Harrison being buried alive because I was too cowardly to act, I knew I couldn't live with that guilt. I made a decision that would either save a life or destroy mine. I would go to the funeral, and if I still believed he was alive when I saw him in that coffin, I would speak up no matter the consequences. The certainty of that decision brought me a strange peace, and for the first time in days, I slept through the night, dreaming of being underwater, fighting to reach the surface, desperate for air that seemed just beyond my grasp. Friday passed in a blur of final preparations, the mansion transformed into a somber shrine to the deceased, and I went through the motions of my duties while my mind focused entirely on the next day and what I might have to do. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would say it, tried to prepare myself for the backlash I knew would come, and prayed that if I was wrong, if he really was dead and I made a fool of myself, that Mr. Harrison would forgive me from whatever afterlife he inhabited. That evening, I visited the room where his body was being kept in the coffin before transport to the mausoleum, and I stood there for a long time, studying his face through the glass top, looking for any sign, any tiny indication that I was right. He looked peaceful, almost sleeping, and that only strengthened my resolve because death doesn't look peaceful. It looks empty. And this looked like sleep, like waiting, like suspended animation. I whispered to him, made a promise that if he was still in there somewhere, I wouldn't let them bury him, wouldn't let him suffocate in darkness and silence, wouldn't abandon him to a living death. My hands were shaking as I left the room, and I knew that tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. Tomorrow I would either be a hero or a pariah, would either save a life or lose everything I'd worked for. But there was no going back now. I'd made my choice, and I would see it through to whatever end awaited me. Saturday morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of weather that seems designed for funerals, with heavy clouds pressing down on the world and a damp chill that seeped into your bones. I dressed in my darkest clothes, not as a mourner, but as someone preparing for battle, and arrived at the mausoleum an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The family had decided to hold the service there rather than at a church, a choice that struck me as odd and convenient because it was private property, isolated with no random witnesses to whatever might unfold. The mausoleum itself was an imposing structure of white marble and granite, built into a hillside on the estate's far edge, surrounded by manicured gardens that looked stark and skeletal in the late September cold. I wasn't officially invited to the funeral, staff weren't expected to attend, but I'd made up my mind that wild horses couldn't keep me away. So I positioned myself at the back of the small gathering, trying to be invisible while staying close enough to see and hear everything. The coffin had been placed on a raised platform, still open for final viewing, and I kept my eyes locked on it, watching for any sign, any movement, any indication that I was right to be there. Family members began arriving, dressed in expensive black, their faces appropriately solemn, and I watched them file past the coffin, each stopping to pay their respects, none lingering long or showing genuine emotion. Mrs. Harrison was a vision in designer mourning clothes. Her performance of widow's grief so polished it would have been impressive if it wasn't so grotesque. And when she leaned down to kiss her husband's forehead, I saw her lips move in what looked like whispered words, but her expression was triumphant rather than sad, and something about that moment hardened my resolve into diamond-sharp clarity. The ceremony began with a minister I'd never seen before, someone hired just for this occasion, delivering generic platitudes about a man he'd clearly never met, talking about legacy and contribution in vague terms that could apply to anyone. I barely heard the words. My entire focus concentrated on that coffin and the man inside it, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, my palms sweating despite the cold, every nerve in my body screaming that I was about to do something irreversible. The minister droned on about ashes to ashes and dust to dust, and I felt time slowing down, the moment stretching like taffy, and I knew that in seconds they would close the coffin and seal it in the crypt, and it would be too late to save him if he needed saving, too late to speak truth, if truth needed speaking, too late to be anything but a coward who let fear override conviction. I don't remember making the conscious decision to move. My body acted before my brain could stop it, and suddenly I was pushing through the small crowd, my voice ringing out in the marble chamber, loud and clear and absolutely certain. Stop! You can't bury him! He's still breathing! The reaction was instantaneous and explosive, gasps and shouts erupting around me, all eyes turning to stare at the crazy maid who'd just interrupted a funeral with an impossible claim, and I felt the weight of their shock and anger and disbelief crushing down on me like a physical force. Mrs. Harrison's face went white with fury, her mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something cold and calculating and dangerous underneath, and she hissed at me to be quiet, to leave immediately, to stop making a scene. But I was beyond caring about consequences now, beyond fear or self-preservation, operating on pure instinct and desperate hope. I pushed forward to the coffin and bent over it, my face inches from Mr. Harrison's, and I placed my hand on his chest, feeling for the rise and fall of breathing that I was praying would be there. For a terrible moment, I felt nothing, and doubt crashed over me like a wave. What if I was wrong? What if I'd just destroyed my life for nothing? What if he really was dead and I was just a delusional fool? But then, so faint I almost missed it. I felt movement, the slightest expansion of his chest, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. But it was there. It was real. He was breathing. I looked up at the crowd, at the faces staring at me with a mixture of horror and contempt, and I said it again, louder this time, with absolute conviction. He's still breathing. This man is not dead. You need to call an ambulance right now. The chaos that followed was indescribable. Some people rushing forward to check for themselves. Others shouting that I was insane, Mrs. Harrison screaming for security to remove me. Marcus trying to pull me away from the coffin. And through it all, I held my ground, refusing to move, refusing to be silenced, protecting him with my body because if I let them close that coffin now, if I let them seal him away, I knew he would never come out alive. Someone, I never found out who, must have called emergency services because within minutes I heard sirens, and then paramedics were rushing in, professional and efficient, and I finally stepped back to let them work, my legs shaking so badly I nearly collapsed. I watched them check his vitals, saw the confusion on their faces as they found a pulse, weak and slow, but definitely there. Heard them calling for equipment and backup, ordering everyone back, treating this not as a body to be buried, but as a patient to be saved. The lead paramedic looked at me and asked who I was and how I knew, and I told him simply that I'd found him, that something felt wrong, that I couldn't let him be buried without being absolutely sure. He nodded at me with something that looked like respect and said, "You might have just saved this man's life," and those words hit me like a thunderbolt, the reality of what was happening finally sinking in. I'd been right, impossibly, incredibly right, and he was alive. He was going to get help. He was going to survive because I'd trusted my instinct over everyone else's certainty. The aftermath of stopping the funeral played out like a fever dream, with paramedics working frantically over Mr. Harrison's body while family members argued and accused and tried to make sense of what was happening. Mrs. Harrison had gone from shocked to coldly furious, her eyes burning into me with hatred so intense I could feel it like heat, and she kept demanding explanations that no one could give, insisting that this was impossible, that her husband had been properly examined and pronounced dead, that I had somehow staged this or was lying about what I'd felt. Marcus was even more aggressive, getting in my face and accusing me of everything from fraud to witchcraft, his desperation to maintain the narrative of his father's death, revealing far more than he probably intended. Only Sarah seemed genuinely concerned for her father rather than the implications of his survival, hovering near the paramedics with tears streaming down her face, whether from relief or guilt I couldn't tell. The paramedics worked with urgent efficiency, starting an IV line, placing oxygen, monitoring vitals that were dangerously weak but definitely present, and I heard one of them saying something about suspected drug-induced paralysis, about toxic levels of medication in someone this unresponsive. Words that sent ice through my veins because they confirmed what some dark part of me had already suspected. This wasn't natural. This wasn't an illness. This was something done to him deliberately. The senior paramedic made the call to transport him immediately to the hospital, and as they loaded him onto the stretcher, I caught a glimpse of his face, still deathly pale but with slightly better color than before, as if the oxygen was already helping, as if life was slowly returning to a body that had been hovering on the edge of oblivion. I wanted to go with them, to stay by his side and make sure nothing else happened to him, but I wasn't family and had no right, so I stood there helplessly as the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, taking him to safety, or at least to answers. The moment the ambulance disappeared from view, the family turned on me with unified fury, Mrs. Harrison leading the charge with accusations and threats, telling me I was fired, that I would never work in this city again, that she would sue me for emotional distress and defamation and anything else her lawyers could think of. I listened to her rage with a strange detachment, none of her threats mattering because I'd done what I needed to do. I'd saved a life, and whatever consequences came from that were prices I was willing to pay. But then something unexpected happened. The minister who'd been conducting the service stepped forward and said in a quiet but firm voice that perhaps everyone should calm down and wait for medical facts before making accusations. That clearly something extraordinary had happened and the truth would come out in time. His intervention seemed to deflate some of the family's anger, or maybe they realized that making a scene in front of witnesses wasn't in their best interests, and gradually people began to disperse, leaving in expensive cars, their funeral interrupted, and their plans, whatever those plans had been, thoroughly disrupted. I found myself alone in the mausoleum with just a few staff members who'd been setting up the burial, and one of them, an older man who'd worked for the family longer than I had, came over and squeezed my shoulder, saying quietly, "You did the right thing. Whatever happens now, you did the right thing." His words brought tears to my eyes. The first I'd cried through this whole ordeal, and I let myself have a moment of emotional release before pulling myself together and heading back to the mansion, uncertain of what I would find there, but knowing I couldn't just disappear. Not yet. Not until I knew he was truly safe. The drive back was surreal, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, my mind replaying the moment I'd shouted out, the moment everything changed, and I couldn't quite believe I'd actually done it, that I'd stood up in front of all those powerful people and called them liars, that I'd trusted myself over doctors and family and common sense. When I arrived at the mansion, I half expected to find my belongings thrown out and the locks changed, but instead, the house was eerily quiet. Most of the family still at the hospital, I assumed, and I let myself in through the service entrance like always, moving through familiar rooms that now felt alien and threatening. I made my way to my room and collapsed on the bed, exhaustion crashing over me like a wave, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind too wired, too full of questions and fears and desperate hope. I kept thinking about what the paramedic had said, about drug-induced paralysis, about toxic levels of medication. And I realized that if I was right, if someone had tried to kill Mr. Harrison by making him appear dead, then I had just made myself a target. I knew too much. I'd disrupted their plan. And people who would poison someone and bury them alive wouldn't hesitate to silence a maid who threatened to expose them. Fear tried to take hold, but I pushed it down, refusing to let it paralyze me. I'd come this far, and I wouldn't back down now. Wouldn't let them intimidate me into silence. Wouldn't abandon Mr. Harrison when he might still need someone to advocate for him. I decided to stay in the mansion, to keep my eyes and ears open, to document anything suspicious I observed, because if this was attempted murder, someone needed to build a case, needed to pay attention to the details everyone else would overlook. That first night was long and tense, every sound making me jump, every shadow looking threatening. But morning came eventually, bringing with it news from the hospital that changed everything again. The call came at 7 a.m. from Sarah, Mr. Harrison's daughter, her voice shaking as she told me that her father was alive, that the doctors were calling it a miracle, that he'd been in some kind of toxicology-induced coma that had slowed his vital signs to nearly undetectable levels, that another few hours without oxygen, and he would have suffered irreversible brain damage or death. She thanked me, her words tumbling out in a rush, saying I'd saved his life, that she couldn't believe I'd known when everyone else, including trained medical professionals, had been fooled. I asked if I could visit him, and she hesitated before saying that her mother had forbidden it, that Mrs. Harrison was insisting I stay away from the family and the hospital, that my presence was unwelcome and inappropriate. The rejection stung, but I understood. Mrs. Harrison was protecting herself and her interests, trying to control the narrative and limit my access to the truth, but she couldn't keep me away forever. Eventually the facts would come out, and I was determined to be there when they did. I spent that day in a strange limbo, technically still employed since I'd received no official termination, but clearly unwelcome and watched. I could feel eyes on me as I moved through the mansion, could sense the family's resentment and fear, and I knew I was walking a dangerous line. The house felt different now, sinister somehow. Every room hiding secrets, every conversation stopping when I approached, and I realized that by saving Mr. Harrison, I'd stepped into something far bigger and darker than I'd imagined. I started paying closer attention to everything, memorizing details, listening to phone conversations, noting who visited and when, building a mental map of the conspiracy I was increasingly certain existed. I overheard Mrs. Harrison on the phone with someone, her voice low and urgent, saying something about complications and unexpected developments, and "we need to be very careful now," words that sent chills down my spine because they sounded like the language of criminals caught in their crime. I wanted to go to the police, to report my suspicions, but what could I actually prove? that I'd heard suspicious conversations, that I had a feeling something was wrong. I needed more, needed concrete evidence, needed something that would make authorities take me seriously. So I did something I'd never done before, something that went against every rule and moral guideline I'd been raised with. I started snooping, carefully and methodically searching through rooms I had legitimate access to, looking for anything that might explain what had happened to Mr. Harrison. I found medication bottles in Mrs. Harrison's bathroom, prescription sedatives and muscle relaxants, some in her name, others in names I didn't recognize, quantities that seemed excessive for personal use. I photographed the labels with my phone, creating a digital record of what I was finding, building a case piece by piece. In Marcus's room, I discovered financial documents showing massive debts, failed investments, desperate need for money that inheritance would solve. A motive so classic it was almost cliché, but no less real for that. I found emails between him and his mother discussing solving the problem and necessary steps, and ensuring the transition happened smoothly. Language ambiguous enough to have innocent explanations, but sinister in context. Each discovery strengthened my conviction that what had happened to Mr. Harrison was attempted murder, carefully planned and nearly successful, foiled only by my instinct and willingness to act on it. But gathering evidence also increased my danger. I was playing amateur detective in a house full of people who had apparently already tried to kill once, and I had no illusions about what they might do to protect themselves if they realized I was building a case against them. I started varying my routine, locking my door at night, being careful about what I ate and drank. Paranoid perhaps, but better paranoid than dead. The stress was enormous. I barely slept, lost weight, jumped at shadows, but I couldn't stop, couldn't back down, because somewhere in a hospital bed, Mr. Harrison was fighting for his life, and he deserved justice, deserved to know who had tried to kill him and why. 3 days after the interrupted funeral, I received an unexpected visitor, a detective from the police department who introduced himself as Detective Chen, and asked if he could ask me some questions about Mr. Harrison's condition and the circumstances of his discovery. I invited him in, my heart pounding, wondering if this was the break I needed or a trap set by the family to incriminate me somehow. He was professional and thorough, asking me to walk him through that morning when I found Mr. Harrison, what made me suspicious at the funeral, how I knew he was still alive. I answered honestly, holding nothing back, telling him about my research into conditions that mimic death, about the family's rush to bury him, about the conversations I'd overheard and the medications I'd found. He listened intently, taking notes, his expression giving nothing away. And when I finished, he said something that made my blood run cold. "Miss Rodriguez, you should know that Mr. Harrison's toxicology reports showed massive levels of sedatives and paralytic agents in his system, levels that don't occur naturally or accidentally. This is now a criminal investigation into attempted murder, and you may be the key witness." His words hung in the air between us, the confirmation of everything I'd suspected but hoped might somehow have an innocent explanation, and I felt the weight of that responsibility settling on my shoulders like a physical burden. He asked if I would be willing to testify, to share what I knew officially, to help build a case against whoever had done this, and I said yes without hesitation, knowing that saying yes meant painting an even bigger target on my back, but unable to do anything else. He gave me his card, told me to call immediately if I felt threatened or unsafe, warned me that the people involved might try to intimidate or harm me to prevent my testimony, and advised me to consider staying somewhere else until arrests were made. But I refused to leave, refused to be chased away from my job and my mission to see this through. And I think he understood because he nodded and said, "You're brave, Miss Rodriguez. Probably braver than you realize. Just please be careful." After he left, I sat in my small room and let the reality wash over me. I was now the key witness in an attempted murder investigation involving one of the city's most powerful families, and my life had transformed from invisible maid to crucial player in a drama that could destroy dynasties. Have you ever felt like you were in over your head but knew you couldn't turn back even if you wanted to? That was me in that moment, terrified but committed, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult and dangerous but unable to imagine choosing any other course. The days that followed Detective Chen's visit were tense and surreal, with me continuing to work in the mansion while knowing that a criminal investigation was unfolding around me. The family's attitude toward me shifted from openly hostile to carefully neutral, as if they'd been advised by lawyers to avoid giving me more ammunition for testimony. But I could feel their hatred simmering beneath the surface, could see it in the way they looked at me when they thought I wasn't watching. Mrs. Harrison maintained her facade of grieving wife, grateful for her husband's miraculous survival, visiting him daily at the hospital and giving statements to the press about the family's relief and gratitude. But I knew it was all performance. all calculated image management designed to deflect suspicion. Marcus was more obvious in his resentment, barely speaking to me, slamming doors, making comments just loud enough for me to hear about interfering staff and people who don't know their place. But even he seemed constrained by legal advice to avoid direct confrontation. Sarah was the only one who showed any genuine kindness, stopping me in the hallway one morning to thank me again for saving her father and to apologize for her mother's behavior, saying that she knew I'd done the right thing even if it made everything complicated. I wanted to trust her, to believe her words were sincere, but I'd learned that in this family, trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. Everyone was suspect until proven otherwise. The investigation moved forward with agonizing slowness, Detective Chen keeping me updated when he could, telling me they were interviewing medical staff, analyzing the medications found in the house, building a timeline of who had access to Mr. Harrison and when. The doctor who'd originally pronounced him dead had mysteriously left the country, a fact that raised more red flags and suggested involvement in the conspiracy, and the toxicology reports were being reviewed by experts to determine exactly what combination of drugs had been used and how they'd been administered. Each piece of evidence brought us closer to the truth, but each piece also increased the danger, because the suspects knew they were being investigated and desperate people do desperate things. I started receiving anonymous threatening messages on my phone, texts telling me to keep quiet, to leave town, to stop cooperating with police if I knew what was good for me. And while Detective Chen traced the numbers to burner phones that couldn't be tracked, the message was clear. Someone wanted me silenced. I reported every threat, documented everything, but I refused to be intimidated, refused to let fear win, because giving up now would mean betraying Mr. Seo Harrison and everything I'd risked to save him. 10 days after the interrupted funeral, I finally got permission to visit him in the hospital. Sarah had advocated for me despite her mother's objections. And when I walked into his room and saw him awake and alert, sitting up in bed with color in his cheeks and life in his eyes, I burst into tears, all the tension and fear and exhaustion of the past 2 weeks pouring out in ugly, gasping sobs. He looked at me with confusion at first, not recognizing the crying woman in his doorway. But when Sarah explained who I was and what I'd done, his expression transformed into something I'll never forget, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief and profound emotion. He reached out his hand to me and I took it, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip, so different from the cool stillness I'd felt that morning in his office. And he said in a voice rough from disuse, "You saved my life. I don't remember much, but they told me what you did, how you knew when no one else did, how you fought for me. I owe you everything." I shook my head, trying to find words through my tears, finally managing to say, "You were kind to me when no one else was. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. I couldn't let them bury you, couldn't let you die like that." We talked for over an hour, with Sarah discreetly leaving to give us privacy, and he told me what he remembered, the gradual onset of weakness and confusion, the realization that something was terribly wrong, the desperate attempts to call for help as his body stopped responding, the horror of being aware but completely paralyzed, unable to move or speak or signal that he was still conscious. He'd heard everything, the pronouncement of death, the funeral preparations, his family's conversations, and he'd been screaming inside, desperate for someone to notice, to check more carefully, to not give up on him. When he heard my voice at the funeral, heard me insisting he was breathing, he said it was like a miracle, like an angel had come to save him from a living nightmare, and he'd tried with every ounce of will he possessed to respond, to show some sign of life, and apparently his body had finally cooperated enough for me to detect that faint breathing. Listening to him describe those days was horrifying. The thought of being trapped in your own body, aware but unable to communicate, slowly suffocating as oxygen levels dropped, knowing you were about to be buried alive, was the stuff of nightmares. And I thanked God and every instinct I possessed that I'd trusted myself enough to act. He asked me about the investigation, and I told him what I knew, about the medications found, the financial motives discovered, the doctor who'd fled, and I watched his face harden as the reality sank in. His own family had tried to kill him, had poisoned him, and arranged for him to be buried alive, all for money and control of his company. The betrayal cut deep. I could see it in his eyes. The pain of realizing that the people he'd loved and provided for had valued him so little that they'd murder him without hesitation. And I wished I could spare him that knowledge, but truth, however painful, was necessary for justice. The investigation reached its climax 2 weeks after my hospital visit with Mr. Harrison, when Detective Chen called to tell me that arrests were imminent and I should prepare to testify before a grand jury. The evidence they'd compiled was overwhelming. Medication records showing Mrs. Harrison and Marcus had been obtaining prescription paralytic agents under false pretenses, financial documents proving their desperate need for inheritance money, and most damningly, recovered text messages between them discussing dosages and timing and the need to make it look natural. The doctor who'd pronounced Mr. Harrison dead had been found in Mexico and was cooperating with authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence, confirming that he'd been paid to falsely declare death without proper examination and to ensure no autopsy was ordered. The whole conspiracy was unraveling, each thread pulled revealing more corruption and callousness, and I felt simultaneously vindicated and sick. Vindicated that I'd been right to act, but sick that people could be so evil, that a wife and son could murder husband and father with such cold calculation. The arrests happened at dawn on a Tuesday, with police arriving at the mansion to take Mrs. Harrison and Marcus into custody, reading them their rights while they protested their innocence and demanded lawyers. The whole scene playing out like something from a television drama, except this was horribly, devastatingly real. I watched from my window as they were led away in handcuffs. Mrs. Harrison maintaining her composure until the last moment when she looked up at the house and her eyes met mine, and the hatred in that glare was so intense I actually stepped back, shaken by the depth of her malice. Sarah was devastated, torn between relief that her father's would-be killers were caught and grief that those killers were her mother and brother, and I felt profound sympathy for her. Caught in an impossible situation, forced to choose between family loyalty and justice. The media descended like locusts, the story too sensational to ignore. CEO nearly buried alive by family, saved by observant maid, and suddenly I was thrust into a spotlight I never wanted. Reporters camping outside the mansion, calling my phone, tracking down my family, all desperate for exclusive interviews and insider details. Mr. Harrison's company hired security to protect both him and me, recognizing that we were potential targets for anyone invested in the original conspiracy's success. And I found myself living with bodyguards and restricted movements, my simple life transformed into something unrecognizable. The grand jury proceedings were intense, with me testifying for hours about what I'd observed, what I'd felt, why I'd acted, and the prosecutors using my testimony to build their case against Mrs. Harrison and Marcus, painting a picture of greed and premeditation and callous disregard for human life. Sitting in that room, telling my story to a panel of strangers who held the power to indict or dismiss was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. But I forced myself to be calm and clear, to present the facts without emotion, to let the evidence speak for itself. When I finished, the lead prosecutor thanked me and said that my courage and instincts had not only saved a life, but had exposed a criminal conspiracy that might otherwise have succeeded, and those words gave me strength to face what came next. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later, giving both sides time to prepare their cases, and in the interim, my life existed in a strange limbo. I was still technically employed by the Harrison estate, though I'd stopped doing actual maid work, instead staying in the mansion as a guest of Mr. Harrison, who insisted I remain under his protection until the trial concluded. We developed an unlikely friendship during those months. Two people from completely different worlds bonded by trauma and gratitude, spending hours talking about life and family and trust and betrayal, and I came to see him not as my employer, but as a human being, flawed and complicated, but fundamentally good. Someone who'd worked hard and built an empire only to discover that his own family saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to wealth. He confided in me about his marriage, admitting that he'd known for years it was loveless, that he and his wife had stayed together for appearance and convenience, but he'd never imagined she hated him enough to kill him, never suspected that her cold indifference masked active malevolence. We talked about Marcus, too, about how Mr. Harrison had tried to prepare his son to take over the company, had given him opportunities and second chances, had hoped that responsibility would mature him, only to discover that his son saw him as competition to be eliminated rather than a father to be honored. The pain of those realizations was immense. I watched this strong, successful man grapple with the destruction of everything he thought he knew about his family, and I witnessed his gradual acceptance that the people he'd loved had never truly loved him back. And while that truth was devastating, it also freed him to rebuild his life on a foundation of honesty rather than illusion. Sarah remained loyal to her father, choosing his side despite the cost to her relationships with her mother and brother, and he rewarded that loyalty by making her his heir and successor, recognizing in her the integrity and strength he'd mistakenly thought he'd see in Marcus. Watching their relationship heal and deepen was beautiful, A reminder that even from terrible betrayal, good things could grow, that families could be redefined and rebuilt on terms of mutual respect and genuine love. Have you ever witnessed transformation born from tragedy? Watched someone rise from the ashes of their old life to create something better? That's what I saw in Mr. Harrison during those months, and it gave me hope that my own life, so thoroughly disrupted and changed, might also transform into something meaningful and good. The trial finally began in March, a media circus that dominated local news for weeks, with every detail dissected and analyzed, every piece of evidence debated by talking heads and legal experts. And I found myself at the center of it all, the star witness whose testimony could make or break the prosecution's case. The defense strategy became clear early on. They would argue that Mr. Harrison's condition was a bizarre medical anomaly, that the medications found were for legitimate health issues, that there was no proof of intent to kill, only unfortunate coincidence and misunderstanding, and they would paint me as an unreliable witness, an overly emotional maid with delusions of grandeur who'd misinterpreted a medical situation. The attacks on my credibility were brutal and personal, defense attorneys digging into my background, highlighting my lack of medical training, suggesting I'd researched conditions that mimic death only after the fact to justify my actions, insinuating I had ulterior motives like seeking attention or financial reward. Sitting in that witness box while they tried to destroy my reputation and question my sanity was agonizing, but I held firm, answering every question honestly, refusing to be rattled or manipulated, trusting that the jury would see through the legal tactics to the essential truth. I'd saved a life because I'd trusted my instinct, and that instinct had been right. The medical experts were crucial, toxicologists testifying about the specific combination of drugs found in Mr. and Harrison's system, explaining how they'd worked together to create a death-like state, describing the precise knowledge required to administer such a cocktail, and making it clear that this wasn't accidental or medicinal, but deliberately calculated to kill. The prosecution presented the text messages between Mrs. Harrison and Marcus, damning evidence of conspiracy and premeditation, discussions about dosages and timing that left no room for innocent interpretation, and I watched the jury's faces as they read those messages, saw disgust and horror dawning as they realized the depth of the betrayal. The doctor who'd falsely pronounced Mr. Harrison dead testified about being paid $50,000 to conduct a cursory examination and declare death without proper verification, describing Mrs. Harrison's specific instructions to ensure no autopsy was ordered and to expedite burial. And his testimony was devastating because it showed the conspiracy wasn't just about poison, but about covering up the crime by burying the evidence, literally. Marcus took the stand in his own defense, a decision his lawyers probably regretted, because under cross-examination, he fell apart, his arrogance crumbling to reveal desperation and entitlement. And when the prosecutor asked him directly if he'd poisoned his father, he couldn't maintain the lie, breaking down and admitting that he'd needed the money, that his father wouldn't help him with his debts, that he'd felt he had no choice, words that were essentially a confession and sealed his fate. Mrs. Harrison never testified, maintaining her innocence through her lawyers, but her silence spoke volumes, and when the jury looked at her, I could tell they saw guilt rather than victimization. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with closing arguments that were dramatic and impassioned, the prosecution painting a picture of cold-blooded attempted murder motivated by greed, the defense making a last desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt, and then the jury was sent to deliberate, and all we could do was wait. Those 2 days of waiting were excruciating, with Mr. Harrison and Sarah and I sequestered in a hotel, protected by security, unable to eat or sleep or think about anything but what the jury might decide. And I prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life that justice would be served, that these evil people would be held accountable, that Mr. Harrison's suffering and my risk would not be for nothing. The call came on the second day. The jury had reached a verdict, and we rushed to the courthouse, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. And as we took our seats in the courtroom, I looked at Mrs. Harrison and Marcus sitting at the defense table, and for the first time, I saw fear in their faces, saw the reality sinking in that they might actually be held accountable for what they'd done. The jury foreman stood, and the judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and he said yes, and then the words I'd been praying for: guilty on all counts, attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, guilty, guilty, guilty. The courtroom erupted, reporters rushing out to file stories, Sarah sobbing with relief, Mr. Harrison sitting very still with tears running down his face, and me feeling a release of tension so profound I almost collapsed. Justice had been done, truth had prevailed, and the people who'd tried to bury an innocent man alive would spend the rest of their lives in prison? The sentencing came a month later, with both Mrs. Harrison and Marcus receiving life sentences without possibility of parole, the judge's words scathing as he described their crimes as among the most cold-blooded and calculating he'd encountered in 30 years on the bench. And when they were led away to begin their sentences, I felt not triumph but sadness. Sadness that it had come to this, that greed and selfishness had destroyed a family, that a woman and her son had thrown away their lives and freedom for money they would never enjoy. But mixed with that sadness was profound relief and gratitude, relief that Mr. Harrison was safe, gratitude that I'd trusted myself, and satisfaction that justice, though delayed, had ultimately won. Life after the trial took time to find its new normal, with both Mr. Harrison and I needing space to process everything that had happened and figure out who we were in the aftermath of such trauma and transformation. The media attention gradually faded, replaced by newer scandals and sensations, and I was grateful to return to anonymity, to walk down the street without being recognized, to live without bodyguards and constant scrutiny. Mr. Harrison offered me a position as his executive assistant, a role that paid far more than I'd ever dreamed of earning, and came with respect and authority I'd never expected to have. But I initially hesitated, uncertain if I wanted to remain in his world or return to the simpler life I'd known before. We had long conversations about it, about what I wanted for my future, what dreams I'd set aside to support my family, what aspirations lived in my heart beneath the practical necessities of survival, and he encouraged me to think bigger, to see myself as worthy of more than just service, to recognize that my instincts and courage and intelligence were valuable assets that deserved to be developed and rewarded. Eventually, I accepted his offer, not because I needed the money, though that certainly helped, but because I'd realized during our months of friendship that I wanted to build something meaningful, wanted to be part of creating positive change, wanted to use the platform and opportunity that had been thrust upon me to help others who, like me, were invisible and voiceless. We established a foundation together, dedicated to supporting domestic workers and advocating for their rights, providing education and legal assistance and pathways to better opportunities. And I found purpose and fulfillment in that work that I'd never found in cleaning houses. Mr. Harrison restructured his company with Sarah as his partner and eventual successor, building something based on integrity and ethics rather than just profit. And I watched with pride as they transformed not just a business, but a family legacy, proving that it's never too late to start over, to choose different values, to become better versions of ourselves. My own family benefited enormously from my changed circumstances. My daughter received the medical care she needed and went on to graduate college. My parents were able to retire comfortably, and I bought a small house of my own, nothing grand but mine, a space where I could breathe and dream and be myself. The physical scars from those traumatic months faded, but the emotional and psychological impact remains. I still sometimes have nightmares about coffins and funerals, still feel anxiety when I think about how close we came to disaster, still marvel at the chain of coincidences and instincts that led to salvation rather than tragedy. But I also feel pride in what I did, pride that when faced with an impossible choice between safety and truth, between silence and courage, I chose courage. I chose to speak up, to trust myself, to risk everything for what I knew was right. That decision changed the trajectory of my entire life, transforming me from invisible maid to visible advocate, from powerless worker to empowered voice. And while I never sought that transformation, I'm grateful for it. Grateful for the opportunity to matter, to make a difference, to show that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they listen to their conscience and act with conviction. Mr. Harrison and I remain close friends, bound by shared trauma and mutual respect, and he tells me often that I saved not just his life, but his soul, that being forced to confront his family's betrayal freed him from illusions and allowed him to build authentic relationships based on truth. I tell him that he saved me too, that his kindness when I was invisible planted seeds of self-worth that eventually grew into the courage I needed to act, and that our unlikely friendship has taught me that human connection transcends class and circumstance, that we all need each other, that none of us survive alone. Looking back now, 3 years after that September morning, when I found him slumped over his desk, I see the entire experience differently than I did while living through it. Then it was terrifying and overwhelming, a series of impossible choices and desperate actions with no certainty of outcome. But now I see it as the defining moment of my life, the point where I discovered who I truly was beneath the roles and expectations I'd accepted. I learned that instinct is powerful and should be trusted, That the quiet voice inside that whispers truth is worth listening to even when logic and authority say otherwise, and that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do, requiring us to risk everything we have for principles we believe in. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite fear. That being afraid and doing it anyway is the definition of bravery, and that ordinary people like me possess extraordinary strength when circumstances demand it. I learned that goodness exists alongside evil, that for every person motivated by greed and selfishness, there are others motivated by compassion and integrity, and that choosing which values to align with is perhaps the most important choice we ever make. The foundation we created has helped hundreds of domestic workers find better opportunities, provided legal support for those facing exploitation, offered education and training for career advancement, and every person we help feels like validation of that terrible, wonderful decision I made to stop a funeral and insist on truth. We're planning to expand nationally to reach more people, to create systemic change in how domestic workers are valued and treated. And I wake up every day excited about the work we're doing, grateful for the chance to turn my trauma into purpose, my near tragedy into triumph. Mr. Wright, Harrison's health is fully restored, his company is thriving under ethical leadership, and his relationship with Sarah is stronger than ever, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than obligation and expectation. So in a strange way, the attempted murder that nearly killed him actually saved him, freed him from a toxic family dynamic, and gave him the opportunity to rebuild his life on a foundation of truth. We talk sometimes about fate and coincidence, about whether there was some cosmic purpose to everything that happened, whether I was meant to be there that morning, meant to research conditions that mimic death, meant to trust my instinct at the funeral. And while I don't know if I believe in destiny, I know that I'm grateful for every choice and chance that led to that moment, because that moment revealed who I am and who I want to be. If someone had told me 4 years ago that I would go from invisible maid to published advocate, from powerless worker to empowered voice for change, from anonymous employee to recognized hero, I would have laughed at the impossibility. But life has taught me that impossible is just another word for unexpected, that we never know what we're capable of until circumstances demand we discover our strength. So let me ask you, what would you do if you knew something that everyone else denied? If you saw truth that powerful people wanted buried? If speaking up meant risking everything but staying silent, meant betraying your conscience? I hope you never face that choice. But if you do, I hope you find the courage to trust yourself, to speak truth even when your voice shakes, to act with integrity even when the cost is high. Because that's how we change the world, one brave choice at a time, one voice, raised in defense of truth, one person refusing to be silent in the face of injustice. My story isn't special because I'm special. It's special because I chose to act when action was needed, because I listened to instinct when everyone else dismissed it, because I valued life over convenience, truth over safety, courage over fear. And that's something anyone can do, something everyone should do. Because we all have moments when we're called to be more than we think we are, to rise above our circumstances and limitations, to discover that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to be ordinary. This experience taught me that I matter, that my observations and instincts and actions have value, that being invisible doesn't mean being insignificant, and that sometimes the people on the margins, the ones everyone overlooks, are the ones who see most clearly, who notice what others miss, who act when everyone else hesitates. I tell my story not to glorify myself, but to encourage you, to remind you that you too have power and agency and worth, that your voice matters, that your instincts deserve to be trusted, that your courage can change lives. Have you ever been through something similar, a moment when you had to choose between safety and truth, between silence and speaking up? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because sharing our experiences helps us all feel less alone, helps us understand that courage is contagious, that one person's bravery can inspire others to be brave. If this story touched your heart or made you think about the importance of trusting yourself and standing up for truth, please leave a like to let me know. It helps the algorithm share this message with more people who might need to hear it. And if you want to hear more stories about real people facing extraordinary circumstances, about courage and conviction and the choices that define us, please subscribe to I Lived to Tell and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. This channel is dedicated to sharing authentic experiences that remind us of our shared humanity, that inspire us to be better, to act with integrity, to trust our instincts, and to never underestimate the power of one person to make a difference. Thank you for listening to my story, for giving me space to share this truth, and for being part of a community that values courage and compassion, and the belief that we all have the power to change lives if we're willing to act when it matters most. Remember, you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and capable of extraordinary things when you trust yourself and choose courage over fear. So go out there and be the person who speaks up, who acts with integrity, who refuses to stay silent when truth needs a voice, because the world needs more people like that, more people like you, more people willing to risk everything to do what's right.